Well, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming to this conference. How many of you had tea earlier on? How many of you had coffee? Well, when we get to the end of this talk, hopefully you'll understand why I'm asking these questions. We all know about the war between Russia and Ukraine. Before the war started in February, such names as Kiev, Lviv and Azov would have been unknown to most of us. Ukraine has two major denominations, the much larger Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the smaller Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Although 0.2% of the population is Greek, there were Greek colonies in that area of Crimea and Ukraine. The Greek Catholic Church is not ethnically Greek. Its liturgy is Orthodox, but it accepts the Pope as the head of the church. Metropolitan Epiphanius gets his authority from Patriarch Bartholomeus of Constantinople, and Sviatoslav Shevchuk gets his authority from Pope Francis, the Bishop of Rome. Tradition says that the Patriarch of Constantinople gets his authority from the Apostle Andrew, and the Orthodox say from the Bible, that Andrew was the first called. They call him the Protoklitos. That's the Apostle Andrew. And the Pope of Rome gets his authority from the Apostle Peter. How many of you have heard of Codex Alexandrinus? Good. You'll know why I'm asking this question. During this conference, Lord willing, we'll be looking at Cyril Lucaris, Pierre Viret, Griffith Jones, Richard Baxter, and referring to other Puritans. But why bother? It's all in the past. It's history. It happened hundreds of years ago. Does what we're about to say have any relevance for us today? God's work did not begin with our conversion. There is so much we can learn from Christians of the past, and looking at the past helps us to understand the present, including seemingly trivial things like why some people drink coffee rather than tea. We stand on the shoulders of giants like Luther, Calvin, John Owen, Jonathan Edwards, and others. Some of the others are not so well known or completely unknown. One such person is Cyril Lucaris. We know that the Renaissance and the Reformation occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries and had a huge impact and long-lasting effect in Western Europe. We had the reading from Psalm 42. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O my God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? Now, normally I'd like to go back to the Greek, but this time I'm going to go to the Latin Vulgate. After the water brooks in the Latin Vulgate it's ad fontes aquarum. Ad fontes. Ad fontes was the motto of the Renaissance, going back to the sources, the classic works of the ancient Greeks such as Homer, Sophocles, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. And for the Reformation it meant going back to the original Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek of the Bible. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, it became possible in the West to go back to the original Greek because Greek refugees fled to the West, taking with them Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. But was there a Renaissance and a Reformation in Eastern Europe? And if not, why not? The Greek Orthodox people of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries lived far from northern Europe, and they lived far from northern Europe and were under different conditions. And since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, was under the yoke of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. There was great stagnation in culture and education, and it was a struggle to survive. Nevertheless, there were some sparks of Renaissance and Reformation in cosmopolitan Constantinople and areas that were under Venetian rule. From 1204 to 1669, the island of Crete was under the rule of Venice. There was a Protestant movement in Venice because there were individuals residing there who had contacts with Geneva. One such person was Franciscus Portus. He studied in Venice, then became the director of the Greek school. He was an adherent of the Reformed faith, and certain negative comments he made about fasting and the veneration of images caused him to leave Venice. He fled to Geneva, where he became friends with Calvin. He taught Greek at the academy. While at the academy, Portus argued with a certain Scottish man, Andrew Melville, who insisted on using the Erasmian pronunciation. He rebuked him, saying, "You Scots, you barbarians, will teach us Greeks how to pronounce our own language? Indeed." The debate still goes on today. Portus had a nephew called Ioannis Kasimatis. He was born around 1527. He studied to become a doctor in Ferrara, Italy. There he met people of the Reformed faith. He returned to Crete in 1552, bringing with him his new Reformed faith. He preached the gospel, and within 15 years he established a Protestant evangelical church in Candia, which is modern-day Heraklion. In 1568, persecution arose against this church. A public condemnation against this new Protestant faith was declared in the Catholic Cathedral of St. Titus. Houses were searched, suspects arrested and tortured. The Roman Catholic Inquisition burnt his books and arrested Kasimatis and others. They were tried, found guilty, and sentenced to life imprisonment. They were taken to Venice to serve their sentence. Kasimatis died in prison 3 years later in 1571. A friend of Kasimatis was Meletios Pigas. He was born in Candia in 1550 and died in 1601. He studied classical philology, philosophy and medicine in Padua, Italy, and then later in Venice, before returning to Crete. While he was in Padua and Venice, he came under the influence of certain Flemish, German and Italian Protestants. Other Greeks who studied in Padua and Venice obtained what were regarded as heretical books and were converted. Pigas himself never became reformed, but nevertheless he had sympathy with and was friendly towards Kasimatis. In 1590, Meletius was enthroned Patriarch of Alexandria. Pigas had a nephew whose name was Constantine Lucaris. He later changed his name to Cyril when he was ordained as a priest. Lucaris was born 450 years ago in 1572 in Candia, Crete. He grew up hearing stories and learning about Kasimatis and the small persecuted Protestant community of Candia. In his childhood, he studied at St. Catherine's Monastery in his hometown in 1584 at the age of 12, he was sent to Venice for further studies. There was a Greek community in Venice and he attended a Greek school. It is quite likely that Lucaris met the famous painter El Greco, real name Domenikos Theotokopoulos. You know why he was called El Greco for short. Both were born in the same town. Both spent overlapping times in Venice, although El Greco was about 30 years older than Lucaris. And of course, El Greco went on to go to Spain and became a great painter. 5 years later, he was sponsored by his uncle Meletios Brigas to continue his studies at Padua University, one of the oldest universities in Europe. Lucaris studied the humanities, including philosophy. He was possibly taught maths by Galileo, who was a teacher there at that time. Lucaris could speak and write in Greek, Italian, Latin, Arabic and Turkish. He graduated with honours in 1595. Lucaris is ordained as a priest in Constantinople by his uncle Meletios, who was there administering Constantinople's vacant patriarchal throne at that time. Some scholars dispute the time and place. Some historians favour Alexandria as the place of ordination, and the year was 1593. Tell you, when I was researching this, I found historians, got names of places and dates. They were contradictory sometimes, and also the spelling of names that have a variety of spellings as well. In 1596, some historians say 1594, Meletios Brigas sends Lucaris and a fellow graduate from Padua called Nikiforos Kantagouzinos on a mission to what is now Poland and Ukraine. At that time, it was a large geographical area known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There were three rival groups struggling for supremacy and domination: the Roman Catholics, the Protestants, and the Eastern Orthodox. Because of the successes of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the Roman Catholics fought back with a movement known as the Counter-Reformation. This took place in the 16th and early 17th centuries to counter the successes of the Protestant Reformation. It was to a great extent based on the dictates of the Council of Trent, which included increasing the power of the Pope. The actions of the movement included the Inquisition, a court which clamped down on heresy, and the establishment of powerful religious orders such as the Jesuits. In Europe, the Counter-Reformation was most effective in Italy, Spain and Poland. The Counter-Reformation included attempts to coerce Orthodox churches to accept the Pope of Rome to be the head of their church. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an autocratic pro-Catholic king, Sigismund III of Sweden and Poland, was putting a lot of pressure on the large Orthodox Ukrainian population to join Rome. Because of this pressure, a pro-Rome movement arose among a number of Orthodox bishops. In December 1595, a council of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was held in Brest-Litovsk, which is now in present-day Belarus. 6 out of the 8 bishops voted to join Rome. This caused a schism in the church. Those who joined the Catholics became known as Greek Catholics or Uniates. They were allowed to use their own calendar. Married men were allowed to be priests, which is normal for the Eastern Orthodox Church. But they had to accept purgatory and add the filioque in their creed. And if you don't know what that means, I can explain to you later. Those who resisted faced increasing persecution. Most of the ordained leadership, like the bishops and the priests, went over to Rome, but most of the ordinary people, the laity, remained loyal to the Orthodox Church. Lucaris had the formidable task of supporting the Orthodox and trying to prevent them from going over to Rome. In 1596, he participated in the Second Orthodox Council that opposed the Church Union of Brest-Litovsk and worked to undo the union and restore Orthodox leadership in Ukraine. His mission was largely unsuccessful, since all the Orthodox bishops had already submitted to the demand of the Polish king, and they accepted the primacy of the Pope. Lucaris and his companion Cantacuzínos decided to stay on in the Commonwealth and to give whatever assistance they could to the Orthodox faithful. The king's agents, however, held them under careful watch, and a short time afterwards he denounced them as being Turkish spies. Cantacuzínos was arrested and he was put to death in 1598, while Lucaris escaped to Constantinople, but he returned later. In total, he spent about 6 years in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, trying to encourage and strengthen the Orthodox in their faith and oppose the scheming, belligerent Jesuits. One of the biggest problems Lucaris observed was the ignorance and immorality of the clergy, so he set about improving the schools and seminaries and established printing presses in Lviv and Vilnius. He established Orthodox brotherhoods and served as rector of the Brotherhood School and the Orthodox Academy in Vilnius for 6 years. He taught at the Ostrog Academy, founded in 1576 by Prince Konstantin Vasil Ostrogski. I mean, this is a famous academy. If you were Ukrainian, you'd definitely know about it. And it's still going on today. There was instruction in Greek, Latin, and Old Church Slavonic languages, and it was from here that Church Slavonic, using that language, Slavonic, that the Bible was translated. During the period he spent in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Lucaris experienced the toughness of the Roman Catholic policy and also had contact with the Protestants who lived there. In Vilnius, he had informal and friendly discussions with the Lutherans on the question of Christian unity. In September 1601, Lucaris went to Alexandria in Egypt, and at the age of 29, he's elected to be Patriarch of the Orthodox Christians in Alexandria. We should not confuse these Orthodox Christians with the much larger group belonging to the Coptic Orthodox Church. Lucaris succeeds Patriarch Meletios Pigas, who was his uncle, and he had died 2 days after he arrived in Egypt. And Lucaris' tenure lasted for 20 years as the Patriarch of Alexandria. Lucaris comes into contact with a Dutchman called Cornelius Haga. He was the first ambassador of the Dutch Republic to the Ottoman Empire. Lucaris asked Cornelius Haga to provide him with books on the Protestant and Reformed faith. Thus, Lucaris acquired many Protestant books from Holland. He had contact and corresponded with many prominent people. He wrote to David Leleur de Wilhelm, a Dutch merchant, and also Johannes Utenborchardt, an Arminian theologian and pastor. Utenborchardt was one of the most prominent and influential adherents of Arminius and became leader of the Remonstrants. He also had correspondence with the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus and his chancellor Axel Oxenstierna. During Lucaris' tenure as Patriarch of Alexandria, he reorganized its finances and he revived its schools. The Patriarchate of Alexandria regained much of its former glory, and he succeeded in resolving many of the problems that had concerned the throne down to that time. He went to Jerusalem for the enthronement of his friend Theophanes as Patriarch Patriarch of Jerusalem. While there in Jerusalem, he visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and expressed his disgust regarding the ornaments disfiguring the empty tomb of Christ. Lucaris had a cordial relationship with the Anglican Church. He corresponded with the Calvinist Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot. Lucaris sent students to study in England. One of these students was his protege, Metrophanes Christopoulos. He studied in Oxford for 7 years. He was later to succeed Lucaris and become Patriarch of Alexandria. Both Lucaris and Christopoulos liked reading books and collecting books and manuscripts, and many of the items in the collections of the books and manuscripts that today are found in the Patriarchal Library of Alexandria were acquired by these two patriarchs. An extraordinary number of Lucaris' letters are still extant, now to be found in various libraries and universities scattered around Europe. They reveal his thoughts on a number of issues. In his letters to his Dutch friends, he began to show a growing sympathy with Protestant doctrine. In 1613, he wrote to Uten Borchardt that he believed in only 2 sacraments and that they could not confer grace without faith, though faith without the sacraments was equally valueless. I mean, this is important because the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, they recognize, 7 sacraments. He added that the Greek Church maintained many erroneous practices, though it always admitted the possibility of error. In a series of letters to de Wilhelm, he stressed the need for the Greeks to replace superstition by evangelical simplicity and to depend on the authority of the Scriptures and the Holy Spirit alone. He told of his distress at what he saw at Jerusalem, where the behavior of the faithful seemed to him almost pagan. He was glad to find himself in perfect agreement with de Wilhelm on all theological matters. In 1618, he wrote a letter to Marco Antonio de Dominis. Now, he wasn't Italian, and the name sounds Italian, but he wasn't. Now, he had resigned from being the Catholic Archbishop of Split, or Spalato, which I think is in Croatia. Because this man, Marco Antonio de Dominis, he embraced the Protestant faith and consequently sought refuge in England. In this letter, Lucaris is even more outspoken. He says that he finds the doctrines of the Reformers more in accord with the Scriptures than those of the Greek or Latin churches. He begins to discount the authority of the Church Fathers. He writes, "I can no longer endure to hear men say that the comments of human tradition are of equal weight with the Scriptures." He adds that, in his opinion, image worship is disastrous. He writes, "The invocation of saints is an insult to our Lord." Lucaris referred to the papacy as the force of the Antichrist. In a letter to Archbishop Abbot, dated 1616, he writes, "From the Ottomans we fear nothing, but the shock troops, that is, the Jesuits of Rome, were an altogether different beast. The Greek Orthodox communities have reason to fear," and these are his words, "those dogs and deceitful workers, those hypocrites who say one thing and mean another, and even dare to attack God himself, as long as they are supported by the tyranny of the Roman pontiff." Not only did Lucaris fear the crafty deceit of the Jesuits, he also knew of its effectiveness. These emissaries terrify us greatly and impose on our simplicity and use many machinations to bring us under their power, trusting heavily in the show of cleverness and the sting of thorny disputations. During Ottoman rule in Constantinople, being in the highest ranking position of the Orthodox Church, the position of Patriarch of Constantinople, was precarious and dangerous. To secure your election, bribing the Ottoman authorities was common. Rivals would try to discredit you with false accusations and may disclose some past wrongdoings which were true. Because we see this with politicians today. Patriarchs had to show loyalty to the Sultan. Any signs of rebellion meant execution. Some patriarchs were secretly pro-Rome, with the hope that the Pope would send Western armies to liberate the Orthodox from the yoke of the Ottomans. Other patriarchs preferred to be ruled by the man with the turban than the man with the mitre. Consequently, it was not unusual to see patriarchs deposed, reinstated, deposed again, sent into exile, then reinstated, and sometimes executed. Of the 159 patriarchs who occupied the throne between the 15th and 20th centuries, 105 were deposed by the Turks, 27 abdicated and were often forced to do so, 6 patriarchs died a violent death, being hanged, poisoned or drowned, and only 21 of them died naturally while in office. The same person sometimes became a patriarch 5 or 6 times, and several former patriarchs usually lived in exile, stubbornly waiting for an opportunity to return to the throne. When the Patriarch of Constantinople, Neophytus II, allowed an Italian of Greek origin to preach a sermon which openly advocated union with Rome, Lucaris was asked to preach a sermon opposing this view. He was asked to remain in Constantinople to direct an anti-Roman campaign. He was there when Neophytus died in January 1612. A majority of the synod elected him to succeed to the Patriarchate, but he could not or would not pay the sum demanded by the Turkish authorities for the confirmation of his election. His opponents on the synod therefore put up a rival candidate called Timothy, Bishop of Marmara, who promised the Sultan and his ministers a larger sum than was usual, and the synod was ordered to elect him. In 1612, Timothy became the Patriarch. He accused Lucaris of being a Lutheran. Lucaris' reply was that Timothy should be quiet because he didn't know anything about Luther or of his doctrine. Lucaris visited Constantinople again in 1620. While there, Timothy suddenly died, shortly after attending a dinner party given by Lucaris' friend, the Dutch ambassador. The Jesuits promptly circulated a rumour that Cornelius van Haag had poisoned him in order to leave the throne vacant for Lucaris. If this was so, the Holy Synod certainly didn't care, because in 1621, other historians say 4th of November 1620, Lucaris was promptly and unanimously elected Patriarch of Constantinople. On this occasion, he paid the required sum of money to the Turkish authorities. Immediately, Lucaris is faced with great challenges. There is gross ignorance of theological matters among the upper and lower echelons of the clergy. The Jesuits established schools and theatres to educate and, of course, promote the Roman Catholic faith among the Greek Orthodox. They distributed books promoting Catholic doctrines, which they had translated into Greek. One such book was the Catechism by Cardinal Bellarmine. There were constant attacks and threats against Lucaris and attempts to undermine his authority. They sought to replace him with a patriarch who would be in favour of union with Rome. During this time as patriarch, Lucaris issued numerous edicts reforming and reorganizing monasteries, settling questions of episcopal jurisdiction, establishing the first printing press in Constantinople in 1627, and promoting the publication of religious books. He did this with the help of Nicodemus Metaxas, who learnt the art of printing in Fleet Street in 1625. Unfortunately, due to Jesuit interference, the press was destroyed. They arranged for these Turkish troops to go and destroy the press, because they were saying to the Jesuits were saying to the Turkish authorities that he was preaching against Muhammad and Islam. Nevertheless, a certain number of books were printed. Lucaris established schools and reorganized and enhanced the Patriarchal Academy and appointed Theophilos Korydalaios as the principal. Korydalaios was a highly educated and intelligent man. He was a physician, physicist, astronomer, mathematician, author, educator, and geographer. He was also influenced by Reformed theology. Lucaris found friendship and support from the British ambassador Sir Thomas Roe and the Dutch ambassador Cornelius Haga, who he had met when he was in Alexandria earlier in his life. They helped and protected Lucaris as much as they could from the intrigues of the Jesuits and the French ambassador Philippe de Harley, Count of Cessy. There was a power struggle within Constantinople between Catholics and Protestants, and Lucaris was in the middle. He chose the Protestants as allies. During that period, Urban VIII was the Pope. His real name was Maffeo Vincenzo Barberini, and he was educated by the Jesuits. He gave orders to the Jesuits to do all they could to destroy Lucaris. This was planned and carried out by the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide. It was founded in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. Its purpose was to spread Catholicism in non-Catholic countries and to promote union with Rome of the long-established Eastern Christian communities, Greeks, Slavs, Syrians, Copts, and Ethiopians. The Catholics were continuously slandering him to the Turkish authorities through the French and Austrian ambassadors. Consequently, he was dethroned 4 times. He returned to the throne 5 times because he enjoyed the protection and support of the Swedish, Dutch, and English ambassadors, who intervened on his behalf, disproving the slanders to the Turks. To show his gratitude for the support he received from England, he gave valuable gifts. One of these gifts was Codex Alexandrinus. Through Ambassador Thomas Roe, Lucaris presented King James I with Codex Alexandrinus, an almost complete Bible from the 5th century. The section of the Gospels closely follows the Byzantine tradition of the text. By the time the Codex of Alexandrinus arrived in England, the monarch had died, so the gift was given to the new king, King Charles I. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong Charles. Yes, that's better. That's King Charles I. When Laud, L-A-U-D, when Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, he was against the Reformation. When Archbishop Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, he stopped the English ambassador from supporting Lucaris. Another significant figure in the life of Lucaris is Antoine Léger. born 1594 and died 1661. He should not be confused. If you try and look up this name, Antoine Léger, he should not be confused with Antoine Léger, born 1795 and died 1824, who was a French cannibal and murderer. Our Antoine Léger was a pastor and theological professor of the Genevan Church and Academy. In 1628, the Venerable Company of Pastors in Geneva suggested that he go to Constantinople as chaplain to the Dutch embassy. Soon after his arrival, Léger became a close friend of Lucaris and was welcomed as a theological kindred spirit. As Thomas Rowe had left Constantinople, Léger came at the right time to assist Lucaris with the influential support of the Dutch government. Léger encouraged and helped Lucaris in practical ways to publish the first modern Greek New Testament. And when I say modern Greek, I mean, of course, it's obviously of the 17th century. Another undertaking was a catechism for children. Lucaris exchanged letters with Giovanni Diodati, an Italian Calvinist theologian whose translation of the Bible in Italian would form a source and model text of the proposed modern Greek New Testament. The Greek text used was the received text, and the verse on the Trinity, 1 John 5:7, as well as the confession of the Ethiopian in Acts 8:37 were included. Now these verses had been lost in the Byzantine text tradition. Lucaris entrusted the translation of the New Testament into vernacular Greek to the monk Maximos Kallipolitis. Kallipolitis collaborated closely with the Dutch chaplain Antoine Léger. Kallipolitis died in 1633 before the project was completed. Lucaris took over and completed it. The translation was printed in Geneva. 1,700 copies were produced in 1638. Unfortunately, it was not widely read because the Orthodox authorities labelled it as Calvinistic. The Orthodox clergy thought it dangerous for the people to read the New Testament for themselves because they believed it would be misunderstood and cause division in the church. Lucaris saw things differently. In that first edition of the New Testament in modern Greek, the text is preceded by a preface written by Lucaris himself. In this, he says that the gospel which the Greek people now have in a language they can understand is heaven's sweet message to us, and the duty of all Christians to get acquainted with the contents of this message. And there's no other way for one to learn about God's provision for man but the reading of the Bible. He then deals very severely with those who forbid the people to read scriptures, as well as with those who do not favour the translation of the original text into the language of the people. If we read and we do not understand, it is the same as if we threw our words to the winds. Now, when the Greek people have the New Testament in a language which they can understand, it is their duty to read it. So he says, read it, therefore, that you may get the benefit out of it, and pray for those who gave it to you, and may God always lead you into the good. This New Testament was revised and reprinted several times, and more widely in the 18th and 19th centuries compared to its first edition. Sadly, Lucaris died shortly before the publication in 1638, and I'll say more about his death shortly. Léger also suggested to Lucaris that he should write and publish a confession of faith. This confession, Confessio Fidei, was printed in Latin in Geneva in 1629. French, Italian, English and German translations circulated during the same year. 2 years later, a Greek edition of the same book became available in Constantinople. It consisted of 18 short chapters. A later Greek edition, published in 1633, was expanded to include many biblical references supporting each doctrine. This confession is Protestant and Reformed, and lack of time prevents me from going into detail in what it says. If you're interested, please do look it up. The subjects include icons, transubstantiation, purgatory, election, and justification. In a letter to his Dutch Calvinist friend, David Leleur de Wilhelm, he expresses his desire to reform his church, which he considers impossible. If I could reform my church, I would do so willingly, but God knows I'm dealing with the impossible. His confession was condemned by a synod in Constantinople in 1638, convened by a pro-Rome successor called Cyril or Kyrillos Kontaris, and 3 other synods, one held in 1642 in Constantinople, and in the same year a place called Giassi in Romania, and another convened by Patriarch Dositheos in 1672 in Jerusalem. All these synods condemned Lucaris' confession as being heretical. The French ambassador de Marcheville confronted Lucaris and asked him if he was the author of the confession and whether he stands by the doctrines in it. Lucaris' reply was, "I am under no obligation to give an account of my beliefs to the Pope. I am ready to justify my position by reference to the Word of God and to the early fathers of the Church. In the matters of my belief and my eternal salvation, I shall obey neither the King of France nor any other person in the world, but shall strictly follow the dictates of my conscience." Does what he's saying remind you of another reformer earlier on? Yeah. This made the Jesuits mad, very angry. It was obvious that Lucaris would never bow down to Rome, and the last thing that they wanted to see was another Reformation, this time on their eastern side. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at that time was Murad IV. He had a reputation of being very cruel and brutal. I'll just give you one example. He would be near his palace and shoot arrows at any passer-by or boatman who rode too close to his imperial compound, just for sport. In the 17th century, the northern part of the Ottoman Empire included Crimea and southern parts of Ukraine. There was an important town known as Azak or Azov. You may have heard of the Azov Battalion, which had a strategic fortress. In 1637, the fortress fell to Orthodox Cossacks. In 1638, Sultan Murad was about to go to Baghdad to fight the Persians, because the Persians were ruling there. And news reached him about Azov being captured by the Cossacks. The Habsburg ambassador, Rudolf Schmidt-Schwarzenborn, the pro-Rome Jesuit and the pro-Rome Jesuit trained Cyril Kontaris, plotted against Lucaris, falsely accusing him of arranging for the Cossacks to attack Azov. In addition, he was accused of being in correspondence with the Cossacks and the Muscovites. They also persuaded the Sultan that Lucaris was planning to incite the Greek population to revolt and overthrow the Turkish rulers while their armies were engaged in fighting the Persians. In the eyes of the Sultan, this was high treason, and without any trial, he gave orders for Lucaris to be executed. A group of soldiers known as Janissaries were sent to arrest him. Janissaries were the elite infantry units that formed the Sultan's household troops. They were taken as children from Christian parents as a form of taxation, and they were forced to convert to Islam and incorporated into the Ottoman army. On the 27th of June 1638, the soldiers put Lucaris on a boat on the pretense that he was being sent into exile. But he soon realized that they were going to kill him. After Lucaris prayed, they strangled him and threw his body into the Bosphorus. The Jesuits and Capuchin monks succeeded in having 66-year-old Lucaris condemned as a heretic by Orthodox synods and murdered by the ruling Ottoman authorities. A young friend and follower of Lucaris, one of his proteges, was Nathaniel Conopius. After the terrifying demise of his mentor, Cyril Lucaris, Conopius fled to England. He became a student at Balliol College, Oxford, where he met John Owen. Conopius brought something with him which was unheard of in England. He would habitually, every morning, make a hot, foul-smelling drink, which at the time was described as black soot and a barbarous infidel activity. John Evelyn wrote in his diary, May 1637, the date might not be completely accurate, there came in my time to the college one Nathaniel Conopius out of Greece. He was the first I ever saw drink coffee. Some historians would dispute the year Conopius came to England. Later, according to one version of the story, Conopius, along with a Jewish Lebanese man named Jacobs, supplied coffee to an Oxford club. And according to another version, it was Jacobs alone who opened the first coffee shop in the area in 1650. And some historians give the date 1651. I went to this place not so long ago to take a photo. In 1652, the first coffee house in London was opened by another Greek in St. Michael's Alley off Cornhill. It was operated by Pasqua Rose, a servant of the merchant Daniel Edwards, who imported products including coffee from the Ottoman Empire. In 1647, Conopius returned to Constantinople, and then in 1651 he went on to Smyrna, where Izmir today, where he was ordained as bishop of the city. The eccentric habit of drinking coffee, which he started in London, soon became popular, and coffee shops opened throughout England and indeed throughout the world. Now that's why I asked you who had coffee at the beginning of the talk. Many historians conclude that Lucaris was a failure. He failed in reforming the Orthodox Church. He was murdered at the age of 66. Who knows what would have happened if he lived for another 10 years? What is the legacy of Patriarch Cyril Lucaris and his few disciples? Well, it's something more than coffee. I would say that it was the love that Lucaris had for the truth, his desire for the Word of God to be translated in the common language of his people and to be widely read. Despite opposition, in the succeeding centuries, the whole Bible has been translated into modern Greek and is read by thousands of people, many of whom have come to faith and trust in Jesus Christ as their Lord. Lucaris restored, of course some would dispute what I'm saying, restored, because some people say, well, it was never there, but I believe it was. Lucaris restored the lost verses of 1 John 5:7 and Acts 8:37 back into Greek Orthodox Bibles and lectionaries. So if you pick up a Greek Orthodox Bible today, you will see 1 John 5:7 and Acts 8:37. And judging by what we see today, Lucaris succeeded in preventing the Orthodox Church from accepting the supremacy of the Pope. So there are millions of Eastern Orthodox people, Russians and Greeks, Romanians, Bulgarians, and so on, who do not accept the supremacy of the Pope. It is said that truth is stranger than fiction. Figuratively speaking, only figuratively speaking, Lucaris is having the last laugh at the expense of the Pope and the Jesuits. The Holy Synod of the Patriarchate of Alexandria formally canonized Cyril Lucaris on October the 6th, 2009, 370 years after his martyrdom. The declaration of Patriarch Theodoros II announcing Lucaris to be a saint was also recognized by other self-governing autocephalous Orthodox churches. This would be like Pope Francis declaring William Tyndale, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley or Thomas Cranmer as saints of the Roman Catholic Church. Can you imagine that? So we see that Lucaris, nearly 4 centuries later, is still a fascinating and enigmatic figure, paradoxically loved by Orthodox and evangelicals. The fact that he has been made a saint in the Orthodox Church may lead many thousands to learn more about him and the power of and with the power of the Holy Spirit discover the same doctrines of grace that he lived for and died for. Thank you for your attention and patience. Shall we sing a hymn? 370. The Church is one foundation.